So thank you very much, everybody. It's great to have this opportunity. I really want to thank Lightning Tools and Brett for having me and hosting this webinar and allowing me to share with you some stuff about the SharePoint framework. So I got a lot of stuff I want to show you, so let's go ahead and jump right in. Just real briefly give you a bit of an introduction on who I am. Again, my name is Andrew Connell. I've been doing SharePoint since, you just heard the story about going back to 2007. It actually goes all the way back to September of 2003, back to SharePoint Portal Server 2003. I don't recommend doing SharePoint for that long. It's a first-hand experience, but my life has been SharePoint for the last decade and almost decade and a half now. Wow, that's crazy. I've been a Microsoft MVP for different products, content management server, SharePoint, and now it's Office Development and Office Servers and Services for every year since 2005. I also co-host a podcast with a guy named Chris Johnson, a former Microsoft guy, called the Microsoft Cloud Show that we publish an episode every week, so if you're interested, go check that out. And recently also started a on-demand video training company where I'm working on my first course right now for the SharePoint Framework Development. You can just find more information about that at voitanos.io. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but I'm going to try and focus, we're not going to what the SharePoint Framework is. So let's just set a little bit of level setting here. SharePoint Framework came out or was announced in May of 2016. So who is this, what are we going to cover today, and who is this webinar for? Well, I'm just going to talk a little bit first, go a little bit of a history on the SharePoint development, because I think that it's important to understand where we came from and what goals Microsoft is trying to solve by introducing the SharePoint framework, because it helps put in context some of the stuff that some of the decisions that they've made. So why do we need the SharePoint framework, aside from Microsoft telling us we need it? And then we'll talk about what is the SharePoint framework. And I'm going to talk, I'll show you a little demo from an end user perspective on what the SharePoint framework is, but then I'm going to spend most of my time talking about it more from the development point of view. So understanding the development tool chain, the thing that I think trips up most traditional SharePoint developers, and then building client-side web parts. We'll talk about that, and I'll show you a couple demos on building client-side web parts. So who is this webinar intended for? It's intended for web developers. I'm targeting it specifically to those who are what I'm calling traditional SharePoint developers, people like me who have been doing SharePoint development with when we had no way to deploy stuff to the server except for using Xcopy. Then we got features and solutions, and then we got we didn't know they were called that at the time, but then they were starting to be called farm solutions, because then we got sandbox solutions, and then add-ins, and JavaScript injection was another technique we had. So if you are a traditional SharePoint developer / .NET developer, I'm really targeting this to you. You don't need any experience with what Microsoft is calling and what really the industry calls modern web development, which is the tool chain that we're using here. So I'll show you a little bit of this to you. This is the SharePoint framework is a big new thing that's trying to address a lot of challenges here, and I'll even talk a little bit about how Lightning Tools has one of their popular web parts that they have developed as a client-side web part, and give you a link to that at the end where you can actually learn more about that. Make sure I'm on my slide. There we go. So just another little real quick here. I'm not going to spend too much time, but I just want to give you a little bit of information about it. Like I said, I have an on-demand video training company called voitanos.io. I'm working on a course for mastering the SharePoint framework. A lot of what you'll see today has been harvested from the beginning of that course, so you're getting a nice little sneak preview, but of course distilled down into just 45 minutes or so. You can get to more information on that if you just go to the short link there, vtns.io/lightningtools. That'll take you to the page. And today I actually launched a 10-day email course where every day I put a new email in your mailbox, which is all about understanding the SharePoint Framework Development Toolchain. It doesn't cost a thing. It's all free. You sign up there, give me your email address, and I will give you an email once a day for the next 10 days. No obligation or anything. It's pretty easy. If you get tired of it, unsubscribe. One click unsubscribe. It's very, very easy to do. But I will have links to this stuff at the end of the presentation. I'm also going to give you a link to the slide. The slides are just up in the they're Google Slides, so they're all based in the browser. You don't need anything installed. I will give you a link to that at the very end of the webinar where you can get the slides with all the links and stuff in it. Now, throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit your questions. Now, we don't have, well, I have it on the slide using the webinar viewer app. While we don't have that set up, you can please feel free. I'm going to apologize to sending you to Twitter to try and wade through all the political stuff going on these days. But if you would post your question, you just put the hashtag SPFx-lightningtools-webinar. I have Twitter open, and I'm trying to filter out all of the political stuff and just to find just that hashtag for those questions. And so I have time at the very end to do questions, and if by chance we start to run out of time, I will grab all those questions that we don't get a chance to answer, and if you just watch my blog, which is just andrewconnell.com, I will make sure that you get access to, I'll make sure I answer those questions for you and post them in a blog post later on today or tomorrow. Okay? So let's start kind of diving into this. Let's talk about the history of SharePoint development here. Now we're going to blaze through this stuff pretty quick here because, again, we're traditional SharePoint developers, but I want to at least have a context on where we are. SharePoint, the first version of SharePoint that was really embraced by developers, and you could actually argue that, was SharePoint Portal Server 2003. I mean, we had 2001 and SharePoint Team Services 2002, but SPS 2003 and its free cousin Team Services 2.0 that it was based on were the versions that developers really started to customize. This is where I started. It was built on .NET 2.0. It was the first version that really embraced the .NET framework. And now when I say it was embraced again by developers, I really say that very loosely because we had no development model. The API was not documented. If you remember a tool called Reflector back then, man, that was your best friend. So we had to figure out how Microsoft did stuff and then write our own code. The only API we had access to, if you want to call it that, was a server-side API. And it was the same one that Microsoft used to implement SharePoint, the web experience. So we were, basically doing the same thing that they were doing. We had no client-side API. There were some web services, but really we had no client-side API. Anything that we did, any customizations we built, they all ran full trust. I mean, the deployment story was create a DLL, compile it, or write your code against the API, compile it down to a DLL, and then manually XCopy that over to the global assembly cache on your production server. So you had a manual deployment story. Everything was full trust. Not really the best option there. Then came Office SharePoint Server 2007, and this is where you see most people, or a lot of people, really start to jump into SharePoint development. This one still, we only had a server-side API. We had no client-side API, and everything that we built using code was all ran in full trust. We did get two new ways to implement our customizations and to deploy it into SharePoint, and that was with a plugin model that we call Features, with a capital F, terrible name, but it is what it is, and a deployment vehicle called a Solution, which was really just a cabinet file that was renamed to WSP file for Windows SharePoint Services Solution Package. Forgot a few S's in there, but at any rate, that cabinet file contained the features and the DLLs and everything we needed to put on the server. This really triggered a wave of SharePoint development and extensibility. We saw people going crazy with this stuff, and I mean, it's not just I know it wasn't just me and a lot of other people. There were tons and tons of people that started doing this SharePoint customization work, all based around SharePoint 2007. Now, when one of the things that we dealt with here was that SharePoint 2007 SharePoint has always been hard to stand up and manage. I know if there are any IT pros that are on the webinar here, you're probably rolling your eyes saying, come on, you developers, it's not that hard. Well, I mean, compared to most things, I think it required more effort and more hardware than most stuff that we ended up having to stand up and deploy. So a lot of companies were looking around saying, hey, I want SharePoint, but I don't want to host it. So they started looking around for hosting options. And naturally, Microsoft started to look at this hosting option that they could do. Now, when they first started doing this, they realized that having a SharePoint deployment for every single customer was not cost effective. And so Microsoft started looking at multi-tenant hosting options. Multi-tenant meaning that the same SharePoint deployment can be used to host 2 or more customers. But the way that we were doing SharePoint customizations wasn't going to really work with that model, because if I wrote a component and that component blew up on the SharePoint server, it brought down the SharePoint process, which was not only my customer that I'm affecting, but also any other customer that was in that same hardware. So not really a good experience there. So Microsoft really started to address this. In SharePoint 2010, this is when they really started to have a lot of their thinking around multi-tenant, started to drive a lot of the stuff they did with SharePoint 2010. So this is when they introduced something called sandbox solutions, or also partially trusted solutions. Now what these were basically taking the same stuff that we used to do, but siloing it into a little sandbox process that would not work outside of SharePoint, or outside of a site collection. And it allowed us to where if we wrote something that blew up, it would only affect our customer, it wouldn't affect everyone else. Now the problem with this is that developers quickly found that sandbox solutions were way too limiting, and we were still really only stuck with a server-side API. But in 2010, Microsoft did introduce a client-side API. They call it the client-side object model, and they started to kind of do a little bit of work around REST. Well, the funny thing about SharePoint 2010 is that while Microsoft started thinking multi-tenant, when they went to roll out SharePoint 2010 as multi-tenant, they quickly realized that this isn't really all that good, or this leaves a lot to be desired. In fact, a quick little thing here, hope nobody from Microsoft is on the call, so we'll just keep this between those of us who are on the call here. Just promise you don't tweet this or share it. They actually found 60 some odd bugs in the sandbox when they rolled out SharePoint 2010 in Office 365. The first time they rolled Office 365 included SharePoint 2010, so they found a bunch of problems with it. So they started to experience the pain of it, and they said, all right, we need to go through and spend more time with this and really get a better story here. And so in SharePoint Server 2013, that was the first real multi-tenant version of SharePoint. I would call the first multi-tenant version of SharePoint as far as developers are concerned. They spent a lot of time around client-side APIs. They really built up their REST APIs and their CSOM APIs. And they said, hey, this old way of doing development with SharePoint using solutions, it's just fundamentally flawed. We can't let people put code on the server. So what they did is they created this thing called add-ins, or they called them apps, and then they had to rename them to add-ins because a little vendor that lets you buy apps through a little store, when they tried to put their apps inside of another app they had, like Word or Excel on iPad, might not put an I in there, but anyway, they ran into some problems. They couldn't put apps inside of apps, so they had to rename to add-ins. There's a little nugget there. I don't know if that one's public or not, so that one, we'll see. Keep that between us two. At any rate, so the add-ins allowed us to have 2 different ways to deploy our code. Either we deployed it as a SharePoint-hosted add-in, which meant that it was all client-side stuff, so HTML, CSS, JavaScript, that was stored in SharePoint, but it was stored in SharePoint, but it was actually executed in the client. It was served by SharePoint, but it actually wasn't run on the server. The provider hosted that and said, you can put anything you want out there, but it's got to run outside of SharePoint, so like in Azure or AWS or your own IIS box on premises. Now, the other thing we had some challenges with add-ins, and the biggest challenge I think that we had with add-ins is that they really limited they limited how our stuff was surfaced inside of a SharePoint site. So whenever an add-in was added to a SharePoint site, SharePoint actually created a child site where the add-in was installed or provisioned. This allowed Microsoft to isolate the add-in from the rest of SharePoint, which was good security and a good barrier between their stuff and our stuff. But it wasn't what we were looking for as third-party developers. All of our stuff that tried to get surfaced inside of a SharePoint site had to be done so using iframes. And iframes just, flat cards on the table, they suck. Because they, while they're great for isolation, they also have a whole nother HTTP request that's going to get issued, so you got to go through the authentication and the authorization process, and they're not easy to make responsive for mobile views, and they're slow. Now, the other thing that we started doing to address that is we started seeing people doing much more work around customizing the end-user experience of SharePoint using JavaScript injection techniques. So using things like the content editor web part and the script editor web part to do client-side customizations. But while these were really powerful, we had some problems with them. First of all, they were brittle. And what I mean by that being brittle is that there's nothing stopping me from having page edit access, going into a page, putting it in edit mode, and making some changes to the JavaScript that I just deployed or that someone else deployed for their application. And then you know, somebody who got a JavaScript for Dummies book over the weekend has cracked open the book and they put a weird quote, like you've done those, you know, the right kind of quotes are like the two quotes that kind of go straight up and down. But then if you have the special quotes that if you had done it in Word and you pasted it in, you have like the angled double quotes, and to the layperson it looks fine, but it's not the same character, and so stuff gets screwed up. The other problem with this way of doing deployment is it wasn't very repeatable. So you couldn't say, you know, take this package, install it, and ta-da, you've got my stuff installed on your SharePoint site. It didn't work that way. Another challenge that we had, though, is that while that script editor web part, that thing was awesome, except there are a certain kind of site in SharePoint called self-service site creation, and that applies to my sites, team sites, and group sites. And by default, they have a property on there called that has got script disabled on those kinds of sites. And unfortunately, the script editor web part is not marked as a safe as safe for scripting, and so the script editor web part wouldn't work on those sites. So the majority of the sites we're creating in SharePoint can't even use this technique, which was really frustrating. So Microsoft looked at all of this stuff and they said, you know what, we need to embrace this style of development and really the way that people want to do this style of development. So what they did is they came up with this concept called the SharePoint Framework. So no more history lesson, now we're looking forward. The purpose of the SharePoint Framework is to make client-side customizations an official development model for SharePoint developers, and it is allowing developers to create client-side customizations that can be packaged up and deployed to SharePoint sites just like SharePoint solutions and add-ins were in previous versions. These customizations will also have easy access to SharePoint data using APIs that the framework is going to provide for us. But it doesn't mean you're limited to just accessing that SharePoint data. These are client-side solutions so that you can call anything you want, any data source you want. You can call the SharePoint REST API, the Microsoft Graph, the Office Graph, or any other API you want. Maybe an Azure API, maybe an API you've created and hosted in an Azure function, or maybe over in AWS. One of the cool things about this is that they are all going to run within the current context, and what that means is that there's no more iframe. Now, your applications, when you make calls to SharePoint, you don't have to authenticate because the code's going to be making that call back to the SharePoint REST API as the current user that's logged in. So you're going to get the security trimming and all that stuff built in right out of the box. It also means that the pages are going to render your customizations right in line with the rest of the page. So there's no, you don't have the extra heavy payload request that's going to be going on with the authentication and authorization layer that an iframe would require. The other thing that we have here is it's really the development experience is going to fully embrace the current, what we call the modern web development stack. Now, we're going to spend more time on that and then later on in the webinar, but essentially what this is that traditional SharePoint and .NET development, we're used to using Visual Studio on Windows, and that involves doing a what is it, a 7,000 gig install of Visual Studio that takes 7 hours to download and another 5 hours to install. I know I'm being a bit of exaggeration there, but probably not by much, just by like 5%. And what that's doing is it's installing everything that you need and a whole lot more to do any of the kind of development that you want. Sure, you may need to go get extra tools for SharePoint and Office development, but you get everything that you could possibly need. Well, but it only works on Windows. This new style or this other style, you could call it alternative, you could call it whatever you want, but another style of web development is using more open source tools that are all founded on top of something called Node.js, which you can think about it just like as .NET. And what that's going to allow us to do is to develop not only on Windows, but also open up SharePoint development to Mac OS users and Linux users as well. And also, all the tools are completely free. They're much smaller, and they're all free. But I get that it's also confusing to a lot of people. So we'll spend some time there in a little bit. You should know, though, that all the customizations that you're going to create here using the SharePoint framework, they will work in classic pages in SharePoint, classic web part pages, publishing pages, and modern pages. Another piece here that I should highlight here that you should be aware of is this first party and third party thing. Now, this is a confusing phrase for a lot of people, so let me explain what this means. This is actually a pretty darn big deal for us. The term third party refers to people like you and me that are on the call. People who are creating things and deploying things to run within SharePoint. In the past, things like SharePoint add-ins, they were third-party only customizations, meaning that Microsoft didn't use add-ins to go extend SharePoint. They just baked their changes right into the product. The downside to this is that Microsoft didn't feel the pain that we felt, or they didn't feel the limitations that we felt with these previous extensibility models. So now what first party means, first party would be Microsoft. Third party would be you and me, people at Lightning Tools, right? It's all of us. The fact that this framework has been built and that Microsoft is using it for their customizations of SharePoint and extensions of SharePoint, and we are, is that as they see features need to get added for them to be able to do stuff in SharePoint, when they add those to the framework, we benefit and we can get it too. So that's all pretty good stuff. So, hey, that's great and all, but let's just see what these things look like. So I'm going to show you, switch over here to my site. I'm going to show you what this looks like for a classic SharePoint experience here on a classic page and working with one of these client-side web parts. Now, today, the SharePoint framework only supports creating client-side web parts. And from the end-user perspective, it's basically the exact same thing you're used to using, except all the business logic runs in the client instead of on the server. So I'm just going to make sure I'm still logged in here, so I'm not going to have a fun little authentication jockey that we're going to deal with. All right, so we're good. So let's come over here and let's put this page into edit mode. Now, just as a quick little review, to add a web part here, I say insert, and then I go web part, and then I can choose any of these web parts that are available to me over here. I can choose all the different options that we have here, right? Now, like say, for example, I could do, what is it, like, where's the one that I wanted to show? Media and content. So how about a content editor web part? I add it, hit loading, edit this web part. So how do I edit? We always go like this, and then go to edit, and then I'll come over here and I want to put some content in here. I can say whatever I want. So, you know, I can do whatever I want with this. Click here, add this, and say, here is some new content. Post questions to Twitter. Avoid the draw of a political discussion. There we go. So I go ahead and apply and hit OK. And so that's how I just customized that web part. Now, what does one of these client-side web parts look like on one of these pages? So I'm going to come over here. I'll put this right down here, and I'm going to insert another web part. But in this case here, I'm going to use one of the new web parts that we have. Come on. And I'm going to find one called, oh, lovely. They already changed it. Oh, you guys. You got to love this. This was not like this just a bit ago. Oh, Microsoft. Microsoft's killing me. Where's my news? Okay, well, it looks like my tenant. So usually you would see a little spot where I could do like a news list web part. Let's see if I can just find it real quick. Let me click through all these. Search. No, 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 no. Oh, man, guys. Oh. Anyway, so I used to have a spot here where there was a news web part. I'll show you where that was. So, hey, cards on the table. Let me explain what's going on. Right now, we're in what's called release candidate 0, which by most people's definition, the release candidate should be, any release candidate version should be a candidate for release. That's kind of why we have the name. But we saw a lot of regressions and a lot of issues pop up, like web parts not working inside of a classic web page like you see here. So we saw that when we went from the developer preview drop 6 to RC0, and apparently I'm getting it too right now, which is just great. I actually had the web part on the page here this morning, and when I deleted it, let's just try that one more time. Insert web part. Let's try. Let me save the page. Let's try one more time, but we're not going to stay on this for too long here. Oh, there you go. Something went wrong. You better believe it did. Wow, something went wrong. So something went fine, and then it went wrong again. Good job, guys. All right, let's go here. Developer site. Oh my goodness, look at this. Classic page bundle. Oh wow, everything's breaking now. Fantastic. This is going to kill my demo. That's okay. All right. Let's see if I can get, let's see if I can do something else real quick. So let me go sites. I think I have another site called, I have a site called, I have a site right here at the root. Let's try that one. Okay, so he's here. Let's hope this guy works. Insert a web part. And, okay, so, yeah. Okay, so we're not going to worry about it. I'm not going to edit that page right there. Let's go back over here to page, and let's stop editing. Okay, now I'm going to come over here, and let's come into one of our, I'm going to create something called a modern page. So my other site blew up on me, so let's go to Site Pages. I'm going to create a new page. This is the modern experience here. I'm going to create a new web part page. Oh, nope, not a web part page. Back up. New site page. And this is a modern page here. So we'll just call that a novel page. We've all had pages like that. And you see here the difference is this little thing down here at the bottom. So this thing down here at the bottom, that's where we're going to go through and add in client-side web parts. And so these are all client-side web parts that Microsoft has created and is added to the web part gallery for us to be able to use on a modern page. Now, what you don't see here are all the old web parts that we saw on the previous page. Those were classic web parts that were server-side web parts. Those can't run on a modern page. These kinds of web parts are client-side web parts. These can run on the current page, and they can run on the modern page. And contrary to what I just showed you a minute ago, again, remember, we're a release candidate. We're not at general availability. These will also be available to us on classic web part pages as well. So here I can just go through and make some changes. Hello, world. Today is good. And I can just say, bold that up. And I don't have to worry about saving it because it's automatically getting saved. I can also come in and add, scroll down a little bit, where's my news list. Some of these web parts also have ways to get customized. And so I come over here and I have this little pencil icon on the left, and if I click on that, you can see that, well, this one, really great customization options. There's nothing I can do to change it. So we'll see how we can use that in our own stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and blow these two away. Right, and let's jump back to the demo and let's talk a little bit more about, where are my slides? There we go. Let's come back over to slides and let's talk a little bit more about SharePoint Framework Development. Now, as a developer, we want to know how to create some of these client-side web parts. And if you think about it, I think it helps to kind of look back at what we used to build. So we're going to blow through this really fast because I want to get to my demo of creating a client-side web part. So what did we used to build when we did solutions? You know, farm solutions and sandbox solutions. We had a package, which is a WSP file, which contained things like declarative files and web assets and compiled assemblies, and we generally had to have a version of Visual Studio installed on our machine, and that had SharePoint also had to be installed on that same machine to give good testing, and we usually did that inside of our virtual machines. We had a big developer environment and using a modern version of Visual Studio. So notice there, the purple Visual Studio. Then we started working with SharePoint add-ins. In SharePoint add-ins, we still created these WSP packages. We also had app packages as well. The app packages contained WSPs, but then we still had, you know, declarative files and web assets, and it still meant that we were using a developer environment that involved having Visual Studio on our machine, and at a minimum, we also had an Office 365 tenant and site that we could actually test our stuff live against. But we generally also we're doing this inside of a virtual machine where SharePoint and a full-blown SharePoint install was still configured and stuff, so it was still pretty heavy. For SharePoint Framework Development, things are a lot easier. What you're going to build are these things called SharePoint packages. Now, this is just a zip file with a special name because the Office group likes to rename stuff to make it look special. And it's only going to have web assets in it, so HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. You're only going to need an editor I prefer Visual Studio Code, the blue one that you see here. Actually, I prefer the green one. The green one is the one that gets updated every day with nightly builds. But it is just a text editor. You can use any editor you want. You can use Sublime, Atom, WebStorm, whatever you want. You could use Visual Studio, but just know you're not going to get any of the benefits that Visual Studio has to offer. You're just getting the text editing capability of Visual Studio. That's it. You're getting nothing else. Okay? So to me, Visual Studio is too much to go through and use. I would prefer to use Visual Studio Code at a minimum because the colors look just like Visual Studio proper. There's no designers, there's no tool windows, none of that stuff in Visual Studio, the big 10 gig one. You're not going to get any benefit from any of that stuff. So what does the development toolchain look like? Well, you're going to have to go through and install things like NPM and Node and Yeoman, Gulp, and Webpack. When you do that, when you install the stuff that you need, you're going to get two things locally on your machine. You're going to get all the build tools that you need, and you're going to get something called the WorkBench. And the WorkBench is a way for you to build and test all of your stuff locally. So let me kind of run through and explain some of this. This is a slide, I call this my money slide, because this is the thing that I think keeps tripping everybody up that's getting into SharePoint Framework development. And I think it helps if you compare it to what we used to do. The difference here, just to give you a preview, the difference here is that the SharePoint, when you used to do SharePoint development, so farm solutions, sandbox solutions, add-ins, you installed Visual Studio, you did one install, and you had everything you needed. It was in all seriousness, it was like a 3 or 5 gig download, and when you installed it, it was like another 5 or a 10 gig, install, right? You had this big thing, but you got everything. So what did you get? You got .NET, because a lot of the tools that Microsoft writes are all based on .NET, so they needed .NET. Well, in this new style of doing stuff, all the tools we're going to use are all based on Node. Node is just a client-side JavaScript runtime, all right? I have some slides on that, but we're going to skip those and jump to the demo in just a minute. So there's more stuff in here that you'll see. We need Node, but you need to, if you want my 2 cents, install it and then forget about it. You do not need to be a Node developer. You don't need to know anything about Node. You just install it, just like you install the framework. It's no different than when you install Visual Studio. It says, I need this C++ redistributable. And if you're like me, well, I took C++ in college and I actually got a C+ in it. And then I took it again, and I got a C+ again. So I couldn't get the plus, but at least I got part of the plus. You don't need to worry about that stuff, right? Just install Node and say I'm done with it. You also have a tool called NuGet. We use NuGet in .NET development to go get package acquisitions. So we would get things like Entity Framework, or we get a new add-in to Visual Studio or something like that. In Node, we have something called the Node Package Manager. It works the exact same way. It basically works the exact same way. So this is one tool you're going to have to get a little familiar with just to understand how to manage versioning and all that stuff. And then Visual Studio. You're going to have to install Visual Studio. Visual Studio is, we already talked about what that's going to give you. Over on the SharePoint Framework side, which is the bottom layer, Microsoft is going to recommend that you install Visual Studio Code. Again, any editor will work. And to simulate the experience that you get from the big Visual Studio when you go File, New Project, and it stubs out everything you need, we're going to use a tool called Yeoman. And Yeoman has after you install Yeoman, you then install a generator, and a generator that Microsoft has created will stub out the project for us. You're going to write a lot of your stuff in C#. If you're still using VB, that's okay. You still haven't taken your pills, and you'll get there eventually. But when you did stuff in SharePoint development, we use C#. In in SharePoint Framework development, we generally are using TypeScript. Now, really, you only need JavaScript. Just JavaScript will give you everything you need, but you generally are going to want to. I would recommend you at least take a look at TypeScript. It's going to give you a better developer experience. Now, what about the build toolchain? Well, under the covers, when you install Visual Studio, you get MS Build, and what that is that's the task runner that is used to go build, to go run stuff like compile projects and all that. Over in the Node world, we have all these other tools we can use, like Make or Grunt or Gulp. We use the one called Gulp, and it works the exact same way as MS Build, except for the fact that MS Build uses XML files to define tasks, like compiling stuff, packaging files together, shipping them somewhere. We use JavaScript and Gulp to do the exact same thing. Okay? And then finally, we need a way to kind of put all of our stuff together, like multiple JavaScript files, and put them into one thing. Oh, that's what Webpack's going to give us. Now, of all of these, you only need to know two of them at a moderate level. That's NPM and that's Gulp. And it's just Gulp to be able to know how to run tasks. You don't need to have any knowledge of Webpack. It happens all behind the scenes. There's ways you can customize it, but for 90% of people out there, you don't need to know it. So just forget about it. Forget about Yeoman. Forget about Node. Right? You don't have to worry about that stuff. TypeScript, yeah, it's a language. You're going to have to know the language. So let's kind of, that's what I'm saying, just focus on what you need to kind of, pay attention to. Focus on NPM, focus on TypeScript. I have Gulp at the bottom. That's kind of debatable, but I mean, really, you just need to know how to run one command with Gulp. So I'm going to skip through all of what these things are, what the different slides that I have on the different pieces, just for extra detail stuff, because I want to jump into one quick demo. I would highly recommend that before you install Node, that you should install what's called Node Version Manager. It was built for Mac OS. There's a Windows clone for it. Excuse me. But I would recommend you definitely check that out. It'll help you go through and manage different versions, and it gets away from having to deal with the administrative command prompts. We'll skip through TypeScript, and let's go build something. All right, so I'm going to switch back over here to my demo. Let's come over here to my desktop, and I'm going to open up my terminal window. And I'm here on OS X, but if you were on Windows, everything you're going to see here is basically the same. So I'm going to come over here, jump into a folder here called dev, and I'm going to create a new folder, makedir, makedir, we're going to call this the Lightning Tools Web Part 01, and then I'm just going to change directory into that, cd $_. And I'm going to say yo at Microsoft/SharePoint, and that's going to run Yeoman, that's what the yo command is, and that at Microsoft/SharePoint is going to run the SharePoint generator that Microsoft has given us. All right. Now I'm going to also add in this skip install step at the very end here, and I'll show you why in just a minute. Now it's going to ask me a bunch of questions. What's your solution name? I'm not creative. LTWPO1 looks good. Where do you want to put your stuff? In the current folder? Well, I can see here that yes, I'm in my folder up here. So yeah, I want to put it in that folder. What's your web part name? Hello world. That's the first one. I think we have to do that by law. What's the description? Who cares? What framework do you want to use? We're going to keep it simple. We're going to say no JavaScript web framework. That J should be capitalized, Microsoft. Come on. And it's just going to go ahead and run, and we're done. Just took about 34 seconds to run through that step. Now, I'm going to go launch Visual Studio Code so we can go start making our changes here. But before we actually take a look at that, the one thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to go in and start downloading all the dependencies, and that's all Node packages. So I'm going to do that by just saying npm install and let that run. Now, while that's running, we're going to go get some work done, but you'll see it keep running over there, and we'll see how long that took in just a minute. So what do we want to look at here? Well, if I go over here and I look at my code that's been created, I've got this source folder, and I've got web parts, and then I've got this hello web part TypeScript. There's a lot of other files in here, and frankly, I wish Microsoft wouldn't do this. I mean, there's a lot of junk in here that you don't need, like this yorc, npm ignore, the attributes, and the editor config. You don't need any of that stuff in there. Microsoft has added a bunch of extra stuff there, and it's one of the issues I have with how they've done this. But whatever, it's their game, and they haven't open sourced the generator yet, so we can't go pitch different ideas and stuff like that. But hey, as a community, we can build our own generator. We'll see once they stabilize everything. We'll maybe look at that. Okay, so while that's going through, we're running that. This is what your standard web part looks like. Now you can see here, I've got a web part here called hello web part. Right here is this class on line 13, and it extends base client side web part, and it implements this interface here called hello world web parts props. And then it's got one method called render. Remember this from doing standard server-side development? So here, I'm just going to shove into the inner HTML of the DOM element. Which DOM element? You don't care. It's the one that Microsoft has provisioned on the page for where your client-side web part's going to go. And it just said, shove all this stuff in there. Now, these are little string replacements here. So like that dollar styles, you can't really see that too well, but that's one of those mustache brackets or curly brackets. And what that guy's going to do is that's actually saying, go look at the styles object and write out the property called row. So if I come over here and I look under LOC and I look at this JavaScript file right here, oh, not that one, go away. So where is it? Styles, oh sorry, styles, so here we go. So here's my styles right here, this SCSS. If I come over here, I've got a list of all these styles set up. Now the first time I run this, Microsoft is going to compile this for me, and it's going to have like a styles.row, right? And it's going to build a new file that you see down here in just a minute. But what that is, that's where the styles are coming from. They're going to build something for me for this. So let's go ahead and let's run this the first time. Now I can see that my install process has already run, and oh man, look at that. That took 2 minutes to go download all that stuff to get my project going. That's a pain. But we didn't have to wait for it because I did the -- skip install, which said don't run npm install after you provision a project. Instead, let me go do some work, and while I'm going to get into my code, then I can do that in the background. Now let's see what this looks like. I'm going to say gulp serve. What that's going to do is it's going to build my project, it's going to go package everything up, and then it's going to go start the local SharePoint workbench. Oh, and I got a little error right there. That's always fun. This is a nice little regression that we're dealing with Microsoft. It's a little disappointing here, but at any rate, it's just it shouldn't be one of those things that we see in the general availability bit. Today, to get around that, you just see npm install at types -- and then go for a specific version 4.14.50. It's disappointing that Microsoft should be they should be either doing a shrink wrap build for all the stuff that we're pulling down so that we don't get hit by changes that happen upstream. That's one approach. Another approach would be, well, I'm going to stop there. I've got my own opinions on how they built the developer tooling and stuff, but we don't need to go there. Maybe a blog post for the future. All right, so that's been fixed. It's all running. Da-da-da, and it's loading up my workbench, and ta-da, I'm on my local workbench. Now look at that, I'm on localhost, I'm not even on SharePoint, I'm on localhost, and here if I click this little plus, there's my Hello World web part. And so when I add this guy to the page, there he is, and I can go through and make some changes to him. Come over here, and space here, say Hello World, no, Hello Lightning Tools. All good, right? Now there's some other stuff that we can do with this. Now I'm going to leave this guy running. And I'm going to switch back over here to my code, and let's do some interesting stuff here. Let's come over and let's go modify this. Learn more. That doesn't help. How about go check out the Lightning Tools client side data view web part. I'll give you a link to that at the end. We'll save our changes, and what's happening in the background over here is that the gulp task noticed a change to this TypeScript file, so it recompiled it or transpiled it down to JavaScript, rebuilt everything, and it updated our workbench so that now you can see that not only they've changed it right here, so now we can have this text right here. Pretty cool. The other thing that's cool about this is all working locally, but if I want to try this stuff out in my production site up in SharePoint, I can do that as well up in SharePoint Online. So what I'll do here is I'll go to my page, _ layout /15 /workbench.aspx. What that's going to do is reach into my local machine on localhost, and it's going to allow me to add the web part that I am now running locally on my laptop, but notice it's doing it up in SharePoint Online. That's pretty cool. So I can even make changes to it like I just did a minute ago. Add some more cools here. Hello, what did I say? Check out Lightning Tools. Why don't we do something else here? Let's change this. Let's go. Stay with me. I'm running a few minutes long on the webinar. Nor can I type. That's okay. No one comes to my classes that I teach to learn how to type. Long, NG on the webinar, space. save all the buildings going on, blah, 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 hurry up, finish. And while that's all done, I come back over here, and I come over here, and we can see, stay with me, I'm running late. Here, oh, didn't mean to click that. There we go, stay with me. There it is, I'm on localhost. And if I come over here to the workbench up in SharePoint, if I delete this web part, and I re-add it, refresh the page, there we go. I'm running a few minutes long. Pretty cool. All right. So there's a lot more stuff that I could show you here on the SharePoint framework development here, but I don't want to take up too much time. I don't see any questions that have come in through Twitter yet. I guess let me do this. What we can always do, I can always come back and do more demo in a bit, but let's go back. Let me go back to the slides, and yeah, let me go back to the slides, and we want to make sure that we cap this right at about an hour. So I've got about another 12 minutes left, and I can keep doing demos, but I wanted to go through and open it up to some questions. I can show some other like additional coding stuff and stuff that we're doing with the client-side web part, but let me just do this to make sure that before if anybody is getting a time box and they were planning on leaving right at the end of the hour. First, if you want to get the slides that I showed that I used here in this webinar, you see them right there as the first link showing up on the page. So just vtns.io/pres-lightningtools-slides. That's a case-sensitive URL. So you use that, you jump straight over and grab my slides. Then there's information about how to contact me. The Lightning Tools SharePoint client-side data viewer web part, there's a link to where you can go find more information about that on their site. What's cool about this, about the SharePoint framework, is that originally Lightning Tools, when they built this, it was built as a farm solution. And then when the add-in model came out, they were not able to do the same things that they did with the farm solution because the add-in model had a lot of limitations to it. So they had to go deal with a bunch of that stuff, and the add-in model did not facilitate it. But the SharePoint framework does allow them to do a lot of stuff. So there's a link there that's going to take you to the page on the Lightning Tools website to where they talk a little bit more about their experience. There's a link to, there's a couple screenshots and a link to a video on YouTube where you can see the web part in action. Again, just a couple of links there at the end of ones I showed you earlier. You can preview my Mastering the SharePoint Framework course that's going to be coming out in February of 2017. If you go to that link, just go to vtns.io/lightningtools. That will take you to the page on my site where you can sign up to my mailing list and get free access, discounts and stuff. What I'm going to release in February is going to be the free bundle for anybody to grab. And then on the 10-day email course, again, I mentioned that earlier. If you want to sign up, there's the link for that. Just go to vtns.io/emailcourse/SPFx toolchain. So I see. It's like someone has submitted a question, but I can't see it. I don't know what's going on with my, So I see a question from Bo came in. It says, seems like the SharePoint framework is geared towards ISVs. What's the future of the Office store? So that's a great question. So first, the SharePoint framework, I wouldn't say it's geared toward ISVs. The SharePoint framework is geared towards enterprise development because when you deploy a client-side solution inside of your site, it's got full access to what the user has access to. Right? There's no way that you can kind of scope it and give it permissions and such. So you're going to have to it's designed for like the enterprise, the internal corporate developer. Now in the past we had add-ins which went for the store. Now today the SharePoint framework does not have a story around the Office store. Microsoft has said that that's something that they are looking at and maybe we'll see some information about it coming soon. But today I can't tell you that there's anything to do with the store. So we're just kind of stuck with what we have. There's no store enablement or anything like that, okay? So I guess for that, so to answer your question, Bo, First, I recognize the name. Good to see you again. But right now, I'd say that the SharePoint framework is designed for corporate developers or enterprise dev. It's not designed for building stuff you turn around and can sell from the store. Now, that's not to say that, let's take Lightning Tools, for example. They built their web part. They could sell it the exact same way they sold their farm solutions, which is customers would buy it directly from Lightning Tools, and then they could deploy it. Now, one of the cool things, and it would work on, it could work across your entire tenant in Office 365. Today, the SharePoint framework is only supported on SharePoint Online. In the future, they want to bring that to Onprem. They've talked about that maybe being second half of 2017. We'll see. That's not me being questioning what they've said. That's just saying, that's a long way off. So we'll see. We'll see what happens between now and then. I think that, but today, yeah, we'll just have to. That's where we are. But there's nothing stopping you from going and buying a client-side web part and deploying it to your tenant. They're supposed to have. They talked about like tenant scoped installs. So once you install it once, then anybody in your tenant could use it. I see another question here from Kipper, who actually took training from me back in the day. I've been doing this for a long time, so I wonder how far back in the day we're talking about. But anyway, so Kipper says, I want JavaScript to create an entry in a list. How does the authorization work with the native REST API? Oh, this is awesome. You don't have to worry about it because you're already inside of SharePoint. Your stuff is already running within the context of the current user. If that user's got access to write to that list, then you don't even have to worry about the authentication piece. You basically are just going to write straight to use the SharePoint REST API, and you're good to go. There is a story where you can also add stuff using, what do you call it, where you can talk to external APIs that are secured with OAuth. For those, you're going to want to use the implicit authorization flow. So, for example, if you were going to call like a Azure Active Directory secured endpoint, you could still call that. That actually ties in well to a question I see here by Kevin Hoyt that says, will we ever be able to use elevated permissions? And the answer is with client-side development, you can't, if you're just looking at the SharePoint framework and you're not looking at anything else and just talking straight to SharePoint, then no, you can't elevate or restrict or any of those kind of permissions, okay? It's because you're running as the current user. The only way that you can do that is if your client-side web part calls out to something external, like say a web service that's running in an Azure website or on-prem somewhere or in AWS. Those different things you could then from there leverage the app model and the OAuth model that we have existing in SharePoint to either elevate or restrict permissions on what you can do with SharePoint and calling to different APIs. So with the SharePoint framework, no, there's no way that you're going to be able to do anything with permissions aside from what the user can already do, restriction or elevation. The only way you can do that is by something outside of SharePoint, but your web parts that you build for the SharePoint framework can call those external things. Matthias Peterson says, how about using Angular 2 for SharePoint framework and other SharePoint development? Any problems? Okay, so I'm going to climb atop my soapbox here for just a minute. Out of the box, the SharePoint framework, I'm going to tell you what Microsoft says, and then I'm going to give you what I say. So let me make sure I qualify those so you can get the company line and then the Andrew line. Microsoft tells you that, hey, the SharePoint framework doesn't block you from using any web framework that you want to be able to use. Frankly, that's true. Today, that means things like React. That's the one that Microsoft has chosen for a lot of their web front-end stuff. Works fine with React. Works fine with Angular 1. Works fine with, I wouldn't call it a web framework, it's more of a utility, but works fine with jQuery and Knockout. Now, Angular 2 has a bit of a different approach, and the way that Angular 2 is architected is that for performance reasons, you have to define up front all the components your Angular application is going to use. So, with that being said, can I use Angular 2 to build a SharePoint framework component? Yes, you can. But notice I just said a SharePoint framework component. Your page can have one of them on the page that's been built with the Angular 2. And that's because the second you added a second web part to the page that's built with Angular 2, it's not going to be it's not going to load it because it doesn't know about all those components. There's got to be a top-level component on the page. Now, this is not a SharePoint framework problem. This is, frankly, it's an issue with the fact that Angular 2 has a specific way of the way you define your applications and build them, and it's all based on performance, and generally it's built with the idea that you own the entire page. In SharePoint, it's a composable page, meaning that we can add more and more stuff to it. So I can't I can't say that this is the Microsoft problem or a SharePoint problem or a SharePoint framework problem. Really, it's just a way that it's a nature of a composable page and the nature of what they've done with Angular 2. Now, with that being said, and this goes to another question I see that Neil Gilroy has come up with that says, what framework should I invest in learning? What Microsoft is, or what I've been working with the Angular team at Google, Igor and Jules and Mishko. They know about this. They've been talking to the SharePoint team. There are things that are going on inside of Angular 2 that will, quote unquote, fix this problem, end quote. There are some really cool things that, frankly, I think it's my preferred framework is Angular 2. Right now, if I had to do something in the SharePoint framework, I'd probably use Angular 1. I personally do not care for React at all. It's just a personal preference. There's nothing wrong with React. I don't like it. But that's not to say that Microsoft made the wrong decision or anything. It's just a personal preference. There are some things that are going to change with Angular 2 over the course of the next few months to like year that you will see that will make Angular 2 work inside the SharePoint framework. It's a little early to tell you what that stuff is, but all I can say is that if you look in the direction that they're going with their ahead of time compilation, it's going to make things really good, and I think it's a really good story. So to Neil's question, what JavaScript framework should you invest time in learning? I think what you need to do, I think I would spend time looking at Angular 1 and Angular 2, but in the SharePoint framework context, if you're only going to be building if you're building lots and lots of web parts that are going to go to one customer and they're going to put them all over their pages, then maybe Angular 1. I would, and if you do Angular 1, make sure you do the component style development, not controllers and what's the other one called? Not controllers and directives. Look at components instead. It's like an Angular 1.5 or 1.6 and higher thing, and it's really, really good. I would look at that, and I would also look at React. React takes a very different approach, and figure out which one works the best for you. Like I said, my personal preference is with Angular, specifically Angular 2, but other people like React, and it is what it is. One of my best friends, his entire company, they've decided to use React for their entire web front end, which is fine. It's what they decided. So Bradley Teed says, what is the easiest way to implement this in an on-prem 2016 environment? So the easiest way for you to do this is to put your feet up on the desk, grab a cup of coffee, and wait around until the second half of this year to see what Microsoft says about getting it on-prem, because there's nothing you can do to make this work on-prem. You have to wait for Microsoft to do this. If you want to do the same style of development, then look at the JavaScript injection stuff, because that's really what it is. Brett, so I see, Brett at Lightning Tools, I see that I've gone 1 minute over. I'm perfectly fine answering questions for another 5 or 10 minutes, but I don't know if that's okay with you or what.
Hey, Andrew, yeah, there's a lot of questions on Twitter that's coming through. I think maybe we can answer a couple more, and then yeah, if you wanted to answer the others on Twitter afterwards,
sure,
that'd be great.
Awesome. Yeah, I can do that. So I'll go until I have 12:01 p.m. My local time. So we'll go for another, I say, 9 minutes. And if I don't get your questions, of course, I appreciate Brett's copying and pasting them in Skype for me. For some reason, Twitter's not refreshing for me. Trump must have put a tweet out, but it's I'll go from the Skype one, and then if I don't get to your question, I will take all the questions and I will answer them later on my blog, which the URL you see there on the screen. Okay, so another question here is by let's see if I can get this right. So your first name is Barak, and your last name is, oh man, please tell me if I got this right. Husneguni? Husnegui? I think so. All right, so Barak. Are frameworks like AngularJS and Knockout supported? I wouldn't. Microsoft doesn't support them. Microsoft isn't going to support Angular or Knockout or React or any of that stuff. Microsoft is supporting the SharePoint framework. Those are all web frameworks, and they all should work just fine inside of SharePoint. So the only one being Angular 2 that I mentioned just a minute ago. I have not seen anybody using something called Aurelia with it yet, but as another web framework, but I don't see any reason why that should have a problem with it either. So it really is it's up to you. Using Knockout's there just for data binding. jQuery is there as like a utility library. React is a Vue framework, a Vue implementation framework, where AngularJS is more of a complete single-page app bit. So Serge asked the question, can we automatically provision a SharePoint Framework web part? So today, I don't believe so. I'm pretty sure the answer is no, but today I know that Microsoft is aware of that. People are begging for APIs to be able to do that, so maybe we will be able to do that. Right now, we can't do that. Let's see. From Raj, any idea when full-page client-side SharePoint Framework web dev model will be coming? The simple answer is no. I know that is something that Microsoft has looked at. They've talked about it. It's been something that they talked about publicly. I know that initially they were actually thinking about doing it, but they pulled that back when they started doing this first rollout and they wanted to get client-side web parts done. I think it remains to be seen. We need to get to generally available first, the generally available milestone first, and then we'll see where Microsoft wants to go with this. I know they've got a lot of plans, a lot of stuff they want to do, but right now we just have to kind of wait. But I know that that's one of the things they're looking at. Mark Arend says, can you talk about the dev, test, prod, ALM stuff in this model? Yeah, so the nice thing about this is that there's nothing really per se that's special about SharePoint with this. Every single client-side web testing framework should work just fine inside of the SharePoint framework. I've been doing it with my client-side web parts, and it's been running great. I plan to have a whole module on this in my course that I'm building. So I use things like Mocha to be my test runner. I use Jasmine as my test, my harness for my framework, and then I also use Chai for an assertion library, and I use another library called Sinon.js, S-I-N-O-N.js, for stubbing and mocking stuff. There are some things that Microsoft has around that they've done inside the SharePoint framework to be able to mock your stuff, and there's stuff on their site that show you how to mock the different data coming back to them. I personally don't like what they've done because it's too Microsofty, it's too SharePointy. Instead, I think that it's smarter to build your stuff using a more like with a dependency injection style setup and stubbing or mocking out. Sorry, doing stubs and spies to mock out your different services and have those pull things back. I definitely plan on writing about that and showing some of that stuff on my blog in the near future. So if you just keep an eye on my blog, I will be writing more about that. But I think that whole thing about the automated testing, continuous integration, continuous deployment, I think that story is absolutely fantastic. Because you really can eliminate SharePoint from the equation here and even mock up like SharePoint services and stuff. Let's see, another question from Albert. How about other kinds of development and not just web parts? Well, today, like I said earlier to the person who had the question about full page things that we could build, today it's client-side web parts. That's not where they're going to stop, but they wanted to nail that story and the development story before they moved on to future versions. So Today it's just Clientside Web Parts. I have a question here from Ovidu, who says, how can we deploy the SP package in SharePoint? Well, I ran out of time in my demo, but if you look at dev.office.com/SharePoint, there was a really good tutorial that shows you how to do it. I basically would go to my web part, and I'll just show you this real quick. So I can switch over back to my demo. And if I come over here and I break out of this and I say gulp, I think it's package solution, is that it? Yep. So what that did is that just created this file here called the LTWP-01 SP package. This file you would go upload to your app catalog in your Office 365 tenant for SharePoint, and you would then create a new app inside of your site collection, and the web part would then be available for use, the same way we did with apps. So this story is the exact same. Jay Dinkola says, is there infrastructure to connect web parts? So today, the answer is no. There's no connection stuff that's there. Microsoft is aware of it, something they're looking at for the future. But with that being said, me personally, I don't want to use anything that they're going to provide. I'd rather use some other stuff. Like, I'd rather go through and use some native stuff that we have with just standard web technology with, like, say, an HTTP post message. Since everything's running client-side, once it's on the page, they can talk to each other. They can talk to each other through the DOM, or through like the isolated scope. So to me, I see that people are asking this question a lot, and I see Microsoft wants to respond to it. And to me, the answer is not to get them to build something like that. To me, the answer is let's just use the other tools that we already have. Mark Cole, can I use the SQL as a backend for SharePoint Framework? Your SharePoint. So my answer is, you can write an API that talks to a SQL Server database, have that API running somewhere that is accessible via an HTTP request, secure it. I would recommend you secure it, but secure it however you want, or don't secure it. And then you build your SharePoint Framework client-side web part that calls that API. So can you get to SQL Server data? Yes. How do you do it? You have to create an API to call to it, right? It's not, you can't just call directly to your database. And then I see the last question I have here is by Jerry, and Jerry says, what are the prerequisites for starting with TypeScript? Can I write basic JavaScript in jQuery? Will that be enough? Wow, I just picked probably one of the biggest questions as the very last one. So here's what I would do. I'm a fan of TypeScript, but TypeScript has a very steep learning curve. And it's a learning curve that will take some time to get up to speed on. What I would recommend that you do is force yourself to use TypeScript for your next project. If you're going to use JavaScript, then use TypeScript and jQuery. Okay. Now, force yourself to use TypeScript and do everything the TypeScript way for 1 week. You're going to stumble and beat your head against the wall the first 2 or 3 days, just like so many other things that we learn. But it really, especially if you're coming from a C# background, it's not going to be too hard. From a JavaScript background, it's going to be a little bit more challenging. There's a lot of capabilities of the language that we can take advantage of, but it's really just the type system that's the big piece. I had a slide a little bit farther back in my deck that I skipped over that talks a little bit about TypeScript. I will write a little bit more in my follow-up blog post that I'll publish later today or tomorrow on my blog. If you just go to andrewconnell.com, that will give you a couple other links of things you should go look at of how you can kind of start getting started with it. But it's not so much. It's kind of like it's like, to me, it's learning any language. You can't just say, I'm going to go learn this language. I'm going to work with a project and go tell myself I have to use TypeScript to do that language. Okay? So that's the best way that I could do. So, hey, today, that's all the time that we have for this webinar today. Lightning Tools they did record this webinar, so if you happen to have to step away or you want to review some of it, if you go to lightningtools.com/webcasts, You can go take a look at this webinar once they post it up there. I guess it'll probably shouldn't be too long, but probably shortly it'll be up there. But with that, I want to thank everybody for taking the time to come to the webinar. Definitely go check out the Lightning Tools SharePoint Framework Client-Side Data Viewer web part, and also the link that I have there at the very bottom. If you're having trouble with getting up to speed on the development toolchain, check out that email course that I have as well, and go sign up for that, as it will walk you through and trying to demystify a lot of the stuff that you may be banging your head against. All right. So with that. Hey, Brett, thanks a lot for having me to do this webinar today. I really do appreciate it and talking to your customers.
Thank you, Andrew, as well. It's been absolutely fantastic. It's been a really good webinar, so I think everybody loved it from the feedback we got. There's a lot of people that are saying thanks. We don't have a question, but thank you. So yeah, thanks very much. I really appreciate that. And yeah, just to reiterate, as Andrew said, you can go and check out the recording. It should be up there within or by tomorrow morning. So you should have the ability to watch the webinar back on lightningtools.com/webcasts. And don't forget the 10-day email course. I think I'll certainly be signing up for that myself. So yeah, appreciate that. Thanks very much, Andrew.
Awesome. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.